Hey everyone, this is Bathmetrics. Welcome to episode 17 of Mixing Loud with Clip to Zero. In this video, I'll be explaining some important considerations about whether you should put a high-pass filter on your sounds that own the low end of your mix. Specifically, should you be doing this on your kick and sub tracks? Now, before I dive deep into the video, a reminder for people that are landing on this for the very first time. This is part of a longer playlist called Mixing Loud with the Clip to Zero strategy, and we are currently at episode 17 right here. Covered all these subjects, and I've still got about 8 more topics to go before we're done with the series. So maybe subscribe to the channel and you can be aware of those episodes as they keep coming out in the near future. Okay, so this was actually a bit of an unplanned episode. There were questions that came up for episode 15 where I talked about considerations for controlling the low end of your mix. There were some threads that said, hey, why aren't you talking about high-pass filters? And I'll just point out one such comment. That was the one that made me say, yeah, I guess I need to talk about this. Because I've heard numbers like this before and they irk me when I see them. Okay, so this quote is a secondhand assertion. I cannot verify this for myself. I've never seen either deadmau5 or Steve Duda say this. And if you don't know who Steve Duda is, that's the person that invented Serum, has worked closely with deadmau5 over the years, great engineer. And this secondhand assertion that I cannot personally verify, is remembering that they heard Steve Duda and deadmau5 both say, hey, I'm going to put a high-pass filter here at 32 hertz or 30 hertz for various reasons. And one of the reasons being quoted here is big club stacks can really put out those frequencies below 32, and it can be bothersome or unpleasant anyway. So long story short, I have problems when I see assertions made like that, and I have my thoughts about that, and I want to jump into the fray and offer my opinion for what that's worth. And I do this knowing full well that this is one of those weird, passionate subjects that everyone loves to trot out their favorite quote. I saw so-and-so say X. I saw so-and-so do this in a video. How can you say it's not good practice? Etc., etc., etc. So I'm just going to say this is one of those things like loudness versus dynamics or oversampling versus not oversampling, which I dived into that fray in the last video, which isn't technically one of the CTZ episodes. It's something that might be of general interest to people who aren't using the Clip to Zero method. So I've included it in the CTZ playlist because it's very relevant. But it's also not necessarily part of CTZ, so I didn't give it an episode number and give it a title that said it was part of CTZ. But anyway, that's a big topic of hot debate too. Now, I am me. I have my experience, my opinions, my observations, my reasoning. You don't have to agree with me. It's fine that there are other engineers you can point to who disagree with me. I see engineers disagree about the subject we're going to tackle today all the time. I see people misinterpret and misconstrue what engineers are saying about this subject. I can point to people who are going to back up what I'm about to say, and I can point to people that are going to refute what I'm about to say, name engineers and producers. So this is not a simple subject. I'm going to present my case and my arguments, and it's pretty much up to you to read counter arguments and their case and decide for yourself. There's no easy solution here. This is one of those edge cases of mixing that it gets into really tricky territory. So if you want to put up counter arguments or, your thoughts about it in the comment thread of this video, that's great. The more opinions, the merrier. Just keep it objective. Don't get weird and nasty because I moderate out toxic comments for my video. And do everyone a favor. If you're going to say, I always heard that you should do this or that, try to put a link to the video clip where you saw someone saying that, or the forum clip or whatever, right? I mean, try to help other people see the full context of the thing you're asserting, because that's always useful. And that's what I try to do in my videos is I don't just say do this and don't do that. I try to demonstrate my reasoning, why I don't think you should do this or do that. Okay, so with all that stuff out of the way, let's get to the fun stuff. I'm going to first throw up a bit of a teaser slide to see if I can entice you to actually sit out this video, because as you all know, I do deep dives. They tend to be a little long and chewy, and should you waste your energy actually sitting through the whole thing. So I'm going to make some pretty bold assertions that are going to fly in the face of things you've probably heard in different places. And I'm also going to talk about and demonstrate some things about the arguments for doing high passing, or something I call the bell trick, which is similar. I'm also going to be talking about the arguments against high passing or using the bell trick, and I'm going to demonstrate some things about that. And at the end of it all, you can make up your own mind and maybe have a few tips for how to approach doing this or not doing this in your own mixes. The first thing I do want to make clear, and this is not something that's up for debate, it really isn't. The advice to put a high pass filter down around 20 hertz or 30 hertz has never ever been correctly asserted as something you should do to your full mix. Anyone who tells you to put a filter like this on your mix bus as part of your mastering chain is just wrong. Maybe a professional mastering engineer who gets a horribly messy mix from a producer that has no idea what they're doing, or a mix engineer that has no idea what they're doing, and they just got a massive wall of rubble down in the low end. Maybe a mastering engineer would do this as one of those band-aids they sometimes have to do to fix really bad mixes, okay? A really good engineer will probably come back to you and say, you really need to fix some things about your mix, or I'm just going to have so much trouble in the low end. So here are some concrete suggestions. Please redo your mix and then give it to me for mastering, right? But it's just all going to depend on the mastering engineer. The point is, it's real easy to hear someone say something about this. I heard so-and-so say you should do this, or you'll even watch a video of someone showing you them doing it. And you might completely gloss over the fact that either they're wrong because they're showing it to you being done on the mix bus, or they're showing it to you being done on a specific track, but in your brain you don't quite catch that, and you think you're supposed to do this everywhere or on the full mix at the master track or whatever. No, it's just wrong. Just take this as a given right now. Everything I'm going to talk about in this video has to do with doing it on very specific tracks. Whichever tracks define and provide the focus of the low end of your mix, and that's usually the kick track and or your sub tracks or your 808 tracks, depending on the genre. Okay, so please don't ever do this on your full mix. That's just not up for debate. The reason you don't do it on your full mix is because it's going to completely screw up the phase of all your low end and mid-range sounds. You do not want to do this down in the low end, or all the transients are going to get weird and smeared. You're going to have sounds that were formerly powerful and working together suddenly sound blurry or hollow or just different. You're going to have certain sounds that used to be even in their volume suddenly become a little more up and down and inconsistent in their volume. It's just not a solution on a full mix. And I know some of you are going to go, well, wait, that's what linear phase EQ is for, so that you don't get those kind of phase issues. And you can happily put a high-pass filter way down at 20 or 30 hertz on your full mix. Linear phase EQs make it fine, right? Except no, they don't. I think if you really look around at the mastering engineers and the mix engineers on YouTube who seem to know what they're doing and work in a large variety of genres, and if you find videos where they're talking about linear phase EQ versus minimum phase EQ, especially down in the low end, you're going to find they all pretty much consistently say pre-ringing is a worse problem. I think Dan Worrell might be an exception. So he recently did a video called Sympathy for the Devil, and he made a kind of offhand remark towards the end how you can see the pre-ringing, but he's never really heard pre-ringing as a problem. And that may be true, but I want you to consider the kind of music that I think Dan Worrell tends to engineer most often. I don't think Dan Worrell is a fan of electronic dance music and heavy sub-oriented, sub-heavy, bass-heavy genres of music. I don't think Dan's a big fan of that. It's pretty obvious from his video he put out saying DJs are idiots. Okay, so maybe consider the source. And if you're looking at engineers who do routinely work in loud genres and electronic dance genres and modern pop, which is also very bass heavy these days and sub heavy, you're going to find none of them say linear phase EQ is fine. Every one of them is going to say, no, linear phase EQ creates pre-ringing, and pre-ringing is a problem. And then I guess the other point to make is the only reason you need to ask yourself whether it's worth putting a high-pass filter down in that extreme low end, you only need to think about it on your kick and sub tracks, because all of your other tracks should already be high-passed way the heck out of the way of the extreme low end. And I talk about this in excruciating detail in episode 16, where I talk about giving sounds their own focus in the spectrum. So I'm not going to make this video longer than it needs to be by reiterating that territory here. Go watch episode 16, maybe go watch episode 15 too. And we're just going to take that as a given that I've already explained why every other track in your mix isn't interfering with your low end at all and isn't a consideration and is already probably high passed much farther up the spectrum for very good reasons, right? You do want high-pass filters all over your project, especially if you do dance music or bass-heavy music. That's a given, and I think I could point out videos by... Have I got a Warren Hart here? Okay, so if you don't want to believe Baffy, I'll put a link in the description about Warren Hart saying don't be afraid to high-pass all those other tracks, right? I can point out a video from David Nazi talking about, should you cut highs and lows in mastering, which is effectively, what I'm saying is the crux of this video, but he'll agree with me, don't do it on a full mix. You do it on specific tracks, and a lot of your mid-range sounds and all that vocals and everything else should already just completely be high passed out of the way of the lows. And so they're not an issue, right? So I'll put links to those videos if you want to see these people saying it and not just take me at my word. I think the last kind of global point I want to make before I dive into the demonstrations is even if some of the good reasons for doing this apply to you and your mix, I still would highly recommend, if you cannot hear your low end accurately, you're probably going to do more harm than good by just slapping a high-pass filter down there because you think you're supposed to, but you can't actually hear it and hear whether or not it's actually helping anything or hurting things, okay? So the way I would phrase this is if you can hear your low end accurately, and if you can hear a problem with the low end, that's when you start asking, should I put a high-pass filter down there? That's the way I approach it, because I can hear my low end accurately. Just so you can get some ideas why I show you the ways that I listen to the low end in these two videos, episodes 15 and 16. So go check those out. I'll give you some ideas for how to hear this well enough to decide whether you even have a problem that needs to be fixed, right? And then I think the other broad advice I can give you is that not only should you be able to hear that there's a problem, but when you toss a high-pass filter or use something called the bell trick instead of a high-pass filter, when you do either of these techniques to try and fix that problem, I think it's very much worth using a spectrum analyzer that can show you fixed the problem. It should be able to show you that you have reduced energy in the spectrum in a certain place. And I'm going to demo this carefully for you so you understand what I mean by this. So if any of this is tantalizing, hang with me and we'll get into it. So the first thing I want to do is show you the mix we're going to be using as a test bed for all this. This is the track I made for the Dan Worrell videos, my refutations to his DJs are idiots stuff. But this track is hitting at negative 6.3 LUFS in the mix with no mastering chain, no limiter, nothing. It's just a loud mix, right? Does this sound like a loud mix to you?
I do my best to learn to listen, since you have so much to say. If I connect with your position, I will learn so much that way.
Okay. 6.3 LUFS. Loud. Does that sound squash to you? Does that sound like it's got a completely messed up low end and there's all kinds of rumble and messy mud down there in the low end? Or did the kick sound reasonably tight? Did the subs sound reasonably tight? Did they sound glued together? Did they sound like they belong together, right? This is all clipped to zero. This is made ground up, clipped to zero way, hitting negative 6.3 LUFS in its loudest drop. Definitely beyond competitively loud. And no mastering limiter, no mastering chain, nothing. This is just the raw mix. So this is where I kind of get into, if you don't hear a problem, there's nothing to fix. And in this case, I have no high pass filter on either my sub or my kick in this mix. And I'll demonstrate why I didn't put one on. Did I think about putting one on? Sure, I always do. It's worth thinking about. But the main point I hope to drive home with this video is don't do it by rote. Don't do it because you think you're supposed to. Don't do it mechanically and unthinkingly. When you're playing with these edge cases in audio, like should I use oversampling or not? Should I do this or not? Should I do that or not? You have to know what the rules are and why people sometimes recommend you should do a thing. You have to know what those rules are and how to test for them and how to think about them and how to listen for them in your own mix, and then decide if you need to apply those rules. Or in the case of the electronic genres, especially where we tend to bend and break those rules a lot for various reasons, you need to know when and why it's okay to bend them or break them. Okay? Just never do anything unthinkingly without just like, I'm supposed to do it, let me do it. I'm supposed to do it, let me do it. Understand why you're supposed to do it. Use your brain, use your ears, use your logic, use your perception. Okay? So this mix has no high pass filters. The low end sounds great. Listen again, one more time.
I do my best to learn to listen, since you have so much to say. If I connect with your position.
So we're going to use this as a test bed. What you're seeing down here, this is going to be present the whole time as an oscilloscope that's just showing us the kick track and the sub track. Kick is in orange, sub is in purple. Couple things to know about this mix. It's in the key of D, which is already a problematic range that some producers will tell you don't ever write a song lower than the key of F in bass heavy genres. Others might say you could go down to E, okay, or maybe even E flat. But if you try to go below E or E flat, you're asking for trouble. And yet there are plenty of great producers out there who routinely write songs in the key of C and D that are super sub heavy, super bass heavy. It absolutely can be done. I kind of talked about some principles of making this work in the Dan Worrell videos themselves. Some of my sub notes are actually going down to C. Okay, I'm going all the way down to C, which is 32 hertz, and D is at about 36 hertz, right? So I am playing way below the safe range, and yet all the sub notes have an equal amount of power. They're all clear, they're all articulated. They're not mismatched in their apparent loudness. None of them are obscured. You can even make out that low slide down into C and back up into D. You can hear it right in the first few notes of the sub riff at the start of every bar. Listen.
I do my best to learn to listen.
Do, 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 do. That's the sub riff. And the do is the D. Do, do. That's the C. Do, back to D.
I do my best to learn to listen.
You can make out all of those notes, the C and the D. The C is equally powerful with the D. This low end is tight, okay? No high pass filter. Clean, heavy, heavy low mix. 6.3 LUFS. I really need to make that clear, right? It's like, so let's get into the argument for high passing. These are the arguments we hear trotted out a lot, and they're all good arguments, but they're all arguments that have some nuance to them and some wiggle room and some important caveats or gotchas, okay? So the first argument, and I think the best argument for sometimes high passing or using the bell trick, which I'll show you in a minute, hold on, it's coming, I promise, is that it can sometimes tighten up the response of the kick and or the sub, right? Especially with kicks. Sometimes the way a kick is recorded or the way the bass drum heads were actually tuned and how flabby were they and how muffled were they and what was the beater like and how did the drummer articulate things, especially in recorded kicks for rock music. You can run into a situation where the kick feels a little slow and spongy and it doesn't have quite the snappy articulation and punch you might want in a mix. That's where that kick drum has to be heard through all the rock guitars and everything else. And so sometimes removing the lower parts of the sub range to emphasize a little bit more where that quicker low end transient of the kick is happening can make the kick sound a little bit more defined, a little more tight. And that's a really good reason to use a high pass filter. Although it's sometimes better to use a different trick. I'll give you a link to this video. It's called High Pass Frequency Trick, Easy Way to Clean Up Your Low End Without High Pass. Long title, good video. He's using an EQ like this to demonstrate the concept, but I'll show it to you in Pro Q. So we're down here on my sub track. And I've got a sub generator called Subdivine producing this specific sub. And right after it, I put an instance of Pro Q3 that has a high pass filter on it that's currently disabled with this red button here. I'm going to copy this to the B channel and I'm going to change this to a bell filter. I'm going to set it back to 12 dB per octave, a nice gentle bell. I'm going to drag this all the way to the bottom gain, crank it all the way over here into the 10 hertz range. So this band is full left, this is full left. I'm going to crank the Q up to maximum. This is how you do the bell trick, okay? You pretty much go as low as you can in an EQ. And let me enable this so you can see the curve a little better. And then if you gradually increase the Q, it's acting and looking a lot like a low pass filter over on the right-hand side of this thing, right? So this is the bell trick, and if you put this in the right place and slowly find the Q that's kind of acting like a low pass filter in terms of cutting off some frequencies down here that might be making the kick drum feel a little slower and more muddy than you want it to be, by rolling some of those things off with this shape, it can sometimes actually sound like you're retaining more of the bass, the heft, the thump, the bottom end, the thickness, the fatness of that drum. It can make it sound like you're retaining more of the feel of a kick drum. At the same time, you're making it a little tighter. Compared to doing this with a high pass filter that you just sort of, roll up and down in frequency to find that same point. This can somehow thin out the feeling of a kick drum, maybe a little too much. Sure, it might tighten it up, but also takes away some of the bottom end. I have some conjectures why that may be. So what the heck, let's show you what Baffy's thinking is on this. And I may be very wrong about this, so don't quote me. This is just my spitballing conjecture. Forget the fact that we have Spectre up here. I just want to focus on this instance of Fab Filter Pro Q3 attached to plugin Doctor. Let's put a low pass filter here at 20 hertz. Let's make it like a 48 dB slope. And here we are at 20 hertz, this line. Got a nice steep high pass filter here that's supposedly cutting off, starting to attenuate some of the frequencies between about, 30 hertz, 25 hertz. Where is it? That's about 26 hertz. It's starting to significantly cut into some of the energy right here, and certainly below 20 hertz, right? Now, by contrast, if I copy this to the B channel, go over to the B channel, turn this into a bell, make this a more gentle slope, take it all the way over to 10 hertz, take the gain all the way down, crank the Q all the way up. Now, this can be a little bit, this may be plug-in doctor not really being able to see or calculate something specifically. Like if I just barely bump the frequency up at certain frequency levels, it looks like that dip goes a lot farther. So just assume the fact that this isn't going down more than 5 dB right here is maybe a glitch in plug-in doctors, whatever. Or maybe it's actually just a weird aspect of this plugin. I'm working at such a weird low frequency range, but see how it jumps around. Let's assume, though, I'll just stick this around 10 hertz and get it to sit out nice and long in plug-in doctor. Right about there. Okay, so now it's looking kind of like a low pass again over on this side. And as we crank up the bell, right, it just looks like the low pass is slowly shifting in this direction, like we're moving the filter point of the low pass up here. But I want you to look on this side of the bell, right? This side is untouched. It's like a notch. We've put a notch in our spectrum right around 10 hertz. And we can move that notch up. We could center it around 20 hertz. And this is where, in the one video I've seen Dave Nazi illustrate this trick, he set it at 20 hertz and then started doing this with the slope. And so, let's say we set it at 20 hertz because you're worried about energy here that might be somehow cluttering up a subwoofer trying to reproduce this energy. And so we're mostly interested in cutting out around 20 hertz. Notice that it's still leaving all this other energy untouched over here. I mean, it's kind of also low passed out, but there's still going to be a lot between 10 hertz and 5 hertz and, in the lower range of 10 hertz. This is not touched. By contrast, a high-pass filter gets rid of all this, okay? So this is my very fuzzy guess as to why sometimes the bell trick sounds better and can tighten up the definition of a kick drum, but leave it feeling like it's got some heft to it. I personally think it's because it's leaving this part of the spectrum untouched. And even though technically we can't hear down here and a lot of speaker systems can't reproduce down here, somehow there's something about this still being there that keeps a little bit of that bottom end on the kick. That's my guess, and I could be totally wrong. If you know better, by all means, post a comment and explain what you think is happening. But it's pretty clear that when you use a low-pass filter, all of this energy is getting attenuated by quite a lot. And that means you're getting less overall of that bottom end. And you'll feel it. You'll hear it. You'll hear the kick get lighter. Okay, so that's my little side trip into why I think the bell trick can sound better. And by the way, just to show you this, because I'll be talking about phase in a minute, this is what a low-pass filter at 48 slope is doing to your phase all across this sensitive end of the spectrum. Look, this is 20 hertz. This is 50 hertz. This effect will go all the way up to 1,000 hertz, 2,000 hertz. You're going to be throwing off the phase in radical ways across your spectrum all the way up to here. This is why low-pass filters are bad news on a full mix. You just screwed everything up with this phase shifting, right? Even if you pick a low, kind of gentle shelf, look at this huge phase shift starting at, 20 hertz and in this region, below 20 hertz. And again, it's extending all the way up to 500, even 1,000. You'll be able to see the effects of this phase shift all the way up here from a filter that's way down at 20 hertz. Okay, it's just not good unless you need to, and you certainly don't want to do it to a full mix. It's bad enough on a single sound, as I will continue to demonstrate in a moment. So back to the project and back to this thing. I'm going to show you the phase shift problem next, and I'm going to bring this over real briefly just to kind of highlight some things. I'm going to jump a little bit back and forth between the argument for and against so I can show you things in a certain order. So one of the arguments against using a high-pass filter way down here, or the bell trick, is that it causes phase issues. And again, linear phase is not a solution, because the minute you slap a linear phase on down in the low end, you're creating something called pre-ringing, and especially in bass-heavy genres, that pre-ringing can be kind of audible. Now, let's talk about phase first, though, while I've got certain things visible and I can turn them on and off for you. What we're going to do is we're going to take this filter, which is on my sub track. We're going to disable it for a minute. So when this button's red and this yellow line goes away, it's disabled. And I'm going to also come to my subs and turn off the kick and snare ducker. So now you're going to see the sub overlaying the kick. Let me make this a little larger so you can really kind of see it. Okay. Every time I start and stop the track from this one starting point, this phase is not moving, right? The phase of the bass is locked to the kick. They never shift in position to each other, right? Now, watch the relationship of the purple lines to the orange lines as soon as I turn on this filter. Totally different phase. Let me go back and forth a couple times so you can really see it. See, it's staying there with the filter off. And now it's in a totally different place with the filter on. And it stays in this new place. And that's caused by the massive phase shift of a low-pass filter here. And even if I make this a more gentle filter, we're still going to see a phase shift. It'll be different now, but it'll still be shifted from before. Here's with no filter. And here's with the filter. See, it's not as much phase shift, but it's still a phase shift, even with the gentle filter. Although now we're probably not removing anything even remotely useful down below 20 because the filter's too gentle and it's already down, here at 20 or 25. Let's move this down to 20 just for science and show you that it's still shifting the phase. Here's without the filter and with the filter. See, it's shifted. And if we steepen the filter to 48 again, it'll shift a lot more. Here's without, here's with. Big shift, almost a 180-degree shift, okay? So this would be a problem if I weren't sidechaining this sub to the kick, and if the kick were tuned to the same general pitch as the sub, which in this case it's not, because even though I made a video about making sure you check the phase of your kick and your sub, it was easy to take that out of context. I did it a couple years ago. It was about, there are some electronic genres where the kick is everything and the kick is super heavy, and you might have a sub line that reinforces the kick and is actually kind of perceptually the same thing as the kick. And I don't necessarily mean in the way of an 808. I'm thinking more like techno or something like that. And you just have a sub that's kind of locked in phase with the kick and happening with the kick, and they always hit on the same beat as each other. And for whatever reason, you decided to tune them to the same basic pitch. And in that case, you really want to make sure these two waveforms are in phase with each other. Or if you've got a song where the kick happens alone sometimes, and then other times the sub comes in and hits with the kick, they're going to phase cancel each other and make the kick sound really different than it usually does when it's hitting by itself. That's what that old video was about. So don't overthink that. Most bass music, most electronic dance music, whether it's steady beat genres or broken beat genres, you want your sub to be the thing that absolutely owns the low end. You want your sub to be the thing that goes all the way down to 40 hertz, high 30s, mid 40s, 50s, right? And you want your kick to typically be pitched higher up and having its fundamental, right? If I just go to the kick alone and we measure the distance or length of this waveform, like this kick, if I go from the zero crossing here to the zero crossing here, this kick is a G. And remember, my song is in the key of D. So this is pitched up in a relative way. Exact relative pitch really doesn't matter as much as some people might have you think. Oh, the kick should always be a scale tone of the song. And yeah, that's not necessarily a bad thing to do, but it's also not necessary, especially if your kicks are short. And in electronic dance music, as I talked about in low-end control, my episode on low-end control, your kick should be short because they'll create massive problems in big reverberant club systems, okay, if they're too long, if that tail's too long. So this is a nice short kick, and it's tuned in pitch way above the key of the song. And so even when the subnotes are playing with the kick, they're not the same pitch, and so phase interaction is just doesn't matter, especially since the sub itself is bouncing around different melodic notes in a repeating kind of riff pattern. And so as long as the sub isn't directly interacting with the kick like you see here, these coexist really nicely and phase issues are not a thing, okay? But just to show you, this is why we have to sidechain kicks and subs. Even if they are completely different in pitch, you still need to do sidechaining because of this. When I play this particular sub with this particular kick, this is what the combined waveform looks like. These white lines here are 0 dB full scale. And we've got massive peaks going way over 0, like almost 3, maybe 4 dB over 0. Yeah, that's almost 3 dB over 0 on both sides. And that's going to have to get smacked at some point by a clipper or limiter to get it back down under 0. Now, again, the kick itself is under 0. The sub's way under 0. It's like almost 6 dB under 0. But when you sum them together, that's what you get if you let them interact with each other. Now, if I simply turn on the duckers and we let it be ducked, well, this is what the sum looks like now. And everything's perfectly under 0, and it looks like one kind of continuous waveform. Kick followed by the sub. And there's almost no phase weirdness even in the transition point between the kick and the sub. Okay? So this is what you're ultimately striving for and why we sidechain. And in this instance, when you have properly sidechained your kick and your sub, it doesn't matter if we get a little bit of a phase shift now, right? So I'm going to go back to this thing and I'm going to turn off the filter. And sure, the sub's hitting in a different phase now, right? Here's with the filter on. Here's with the filter off. And you can see this area is going to sum differently, but it's because it's down in the low part of the kick tail and where the sub is crossfading up, the interaction is only in this region right here. And the only real difference you're going to see is this little spot right here. And it's going to look pretty much like a very natural progression from a kick to a sub, regardless of whether I've got this low pass filter on or off. Watch. Here's with it off. Here's with it on. Off. On. Very little difference. And it's certainly not affecting anything that a compressor or clipper is going to have to squash. Okay, so where I'm going with this little demonstration is that if you are properly sidechaining your sub to your kick, and especially if you're keeping your kick tuned a little bit higher up, sitting in a high part of the sub range, even for its subbier kick tail, which should itself be nice and short in duration, and the kick should mostly be a transient. I've heard deadmau5 say, not heard that he said it, but heard him actually say, kicks in dance music anyway, should just be mostly transients. And tuning shouldn't matter. And, if you let a kick be too boomy, for the most part, it'll just create this wall, wall, wall in the club. if it's too long, if the kick tail's too long. There's just all kinds of problems. I talked about that in the previous part 1, episode 15 of controlling your low end. And so assuming you've made a kick the right way for dance music, the interaction here is minimal. And whether or not you turn on a high pass filter isn't really affecting the phase in a bad way. And there's no need to even think about the bad practice of turning on linear phase because there's nothing to fix. There's no phasing issues here to try and avoid. Okay, that's where I'm trying to go with this. So the one argument against high passing that has to do with, hey, it causes massive phase issues is far less of an issue. All right. Nothing out there is really like summing with your sub bass in important ways. It's not like your sub bass has important transients that need to be reinforced by the transients of your mid-range bass tops or mid basses or aggressive lead sounds or melodic backing chordal sounds. Every sound kind of has its own little series of transients. And they don't necessarily interact and reinforce with each other, right? There's nothing that interacts and reinforces the sub on a transient level other than maybe the kick. So you only have to worry about how is the kick and the sub, how are they playing together, right? And so the phase issue and possibly smearing your transients by pushing the sub slightly out of phase relative to where it was before is just not often an issue. So this thing is kind of the weakest argument if you're doing it right and you're only trying to do it down with the kick and the sub themselves on their own individual tracks. You don't have to worry so much about phase. Where you do have to worry about it is how it may create unevenness in the notes, especially in your sub. And the best way to demonstrate that, so this is Flux. This is my favorite analyzer by far.
Do my best to learn to listen.
And the reason I love it is because the definition on the fundamentals is really detailed in their spectrum analyzer. And this multi-band correlometer is just hugely useful for understanding the width and the mono compatibility of your signal.
Do my best to learn to listen.
Like you can see that my true sub range is just very, very mono. The low bass region around 100 to 80, I'm allowing to be a little bit wide because that's where some heft comes in and some sense of width comes in. And don't worry about that. That's from one of the tools I'm using on my vocal track. It has some low-level noise it's constantly spitting out. And then, it's getting wide in here where a lot of width is perceived.
Do my best to learn to listen.
Okay, but it's very controlled. And I'm not worried so much about high-end width in this particular mix. This was a quick and dirty mix for a demo. If I were to finish this out, I might look at ways of spreading out some of this upper frequency width as well. So the main reason I want to focus on this is for the spectrum analyzer. We're going to blow this up nice and big. And I want you to look at the 4 main notes in my subriff. Right around here, right around the 30 hertz to 20 hertz to 40 hertz range. Right here around the 24 line.
Do my best to learn to listen.
And I want you to pay attention to the D, the C below it, and the note just above it. I'm worried about them being the same amplitude, especially the C, because I want that C to have power and be perceived equally loud as the D itself.
Do my best to learn to listen.
Okay, D is here, C is here, and the note that I slide into from above D is right around the 40 hertz mark.
Do my best to learn to listen.
But you'll notice all 3 of those lowest notes are hitting at the same height, just above the 24 line here.
Do my best to learn to listen.
Okay, see that little trace and those 3 little bumps are the same height.
Do my best to learn to listen.
Okay, the more common problem you will run into as soon as you start throwing on a high pass filter is it can create uneven loudness among those notes that are happening down in the subregion. on your sub track. So the big question is, if you're going to put a high pass filter down there because you think you're going to solve a problem you're hearing or solve a theoretical problem you're not hearing, but you just are told there's a theoretical problem you should solve with it, right? If you're going to do this, it's really important to ask yourself, where do I put the filter? And what kind of slope should it have, right? Or should I be using the bell trick instead of a high-pass filter? And the answer to all of these is it really just all depends on your song. And what is the lowest sounding instrument in your mix doing? What note ranges does it live in? How important is it for those notes to have a certain equal power to each other so they're perceived as equally loud and can be audible in the mix, especially if you're in a loud environment that's really hyping the sub in ways that you just can't avoid, but hear how loud they all are, right? So we're going to play with the high-pass filter with a couple different slopes and a couple different positions just to show you the problem. The first thing I'm going to do is kick this up to 32 hertz because, supposedly deadmau5 and Steve Duda said, do it at 32 hertz. And there's a reason for that. There's a reason I could believe in one context them throwing that out offhand as maybe a reason why. This argument revolves around the club stacks, right? The big subwoofer arrays are capable of putting out frequencies somewhat below 30 hertz, right? A lot of our small studio monitors won't even get that far down. Some headphones can kind of get that far down. But, a really big PK sub or something, I could see that putting out a significant amount of energy even below 30 hertz, even though they're starting to roll off above 30 or around 30, they're still putting out energy below 30, right? So on the surface of it, this sounds like a reasonable problem, right? Especially when you consider that most bass music producers are taught it's easy to go down as far as F, but once you get below that, it's really hard to make bass music because a lot of smaller speakers can't reproduce frequencies down that low, and they start rolling off in power after about 45, 43 hertz. And so as you start dipping into E at 41 hertz or D at 36 hertz or C at 32 hertz, they say it can be tricky to actually make that work and make these notes down here anywhere near as loud sounding as an F or F sharp or G sharp or A, which are really popular keys for bass music, right? Especially F if you do the heavy dubstep stuff and mid-tempo and things like that. And yet again, there are plenty of artists who do write songs in D and C quite successfully. My song's in D, and it's even hitting a C as one of the primary notes and sliding back up into D, right? So clearly, I'm able to get equal power out of all these notes down here on any good set of headphones or any bigger system that's going to be able to reproduce this sub. And then I'm playing tricks with harmonics to make it even more perceptible, even if your actual 8-inch drivers or subwoofer drivers aren't really putting out what you expect, or your headphones for that matter, right? So there's ways to make it work. And the problem is, if I've got a D at 36 and a C at 32, and I've put this filter right up at where C is, well, the filter point is at 32, but the knee of the filter is already starting to roll off energy way above 32. So what's likely to be happening to my C and D notes in this riff? Okay, let's find out. Remember those lines that were up here at 24? Those three lowest notes were all sitting right above 24? Look at it now.
I do my best to learn to listen.
See how that C is hitting down about where my cursor pointer is right now? The distance between those two horizontal lines is 24 dB or 36 dB. That's 12 decibels. This is easily 4 decibels quieter than before, maybe 5.
I do my best to learn to listen.
In my headphones right now, I can hear that C is not equally loud to the D anymore. Let me turn off the filter, see if you can hear the difference. I'll go back and forth.
I do my best to learn to
Okay. I am noticeably screwing up the balance of these very important lower notes by having this filter up this high. And so that's where I get into the it all depends, it all depends, it all depends, right? So where you put this filter, if you've heard stick it at 30, just put a filter at 30, just put a filter at 30, just put a filter at 25, whatever number you've heard, they're wrong. They're wrong. You don't just put it at a certain number every time. You have to listen to and look at your actual music and make sure you're putting it in a place that isn't screwing up your music. Okay? Let's put this back down at 20 and show you kind of a slightly different problem. So let's say I put it at 20 and it's still a 48 dB slope. Now we're going to see that it's not interfering with those three notes anymore. They're both hitting at equal loudness right around the 24 line right here.
I do my best to learn to listen.
Okay, it's no different with the filter on or off.
I do my best to learn to listen. I do my best to learn to listen.
Okay, same resolution, same height, same amplitude, same equal loudness. Even if you can't actually hear it accurately on your gear in your room, the spectrum analyzer is telling you the story. It's telling you that those three important notes for this particular song in a dangerous territory are still at equal loudness with each other, equal energy, okay, with a 48 dB slope at 20. So if I were going to put a high-pass filter on this track, I would choose to center it probably around 20 because it's far enough down below those notes that it's not going to screw up those notes, okay? If I start putting it closer to 30, it's going to start screwing up that C because this knee cuts way above the filter point. All right, next problem. What slope should it be? Well, let's make it a nice gentle 12 dB slope. Baffy says if you're going to put low-pass filters on things, try to make them gentle slopes. And that's true when you're doing EQ bracketing up in your mid-range. It's not so true down in the low end because, again, look what's happening. Now, all of a sudden, that knee extends way far up the spectrum, and it's cutting into even more frequencies up here. So watch what happens now. I'm going to make this easy by soloing the subline. Just watch the spectrum analyzer and see where the notes of the sub itself are hitting. See how they're all just hitting right in this range here. There's one kind of high note that's a little bit higher right here. Right? When I do my high riff. Now, right? D, note above, note below, are all three hitting right here. Now, if I pick a different slope, a gentler slope, we see that it's cutting further up the spectrum, and we might expect that the relationship of those notes right here will change, and the amplitude might get messed up again, kind of like we saw happening with the C note earlier. Let's see what happens. It's pretty much the same as before, right? It's only the tiniest bit closer to the 24 line. If I turn it off, right, we can see the D sits up about 2 dB above 24, and then the higher note sits up about 2 dB above the line, and then the C is just about 1 dB above the line. And if we turn on the filter again, they're a little bit closer to the line now. Right? So you may say, well, it's just a dB or two, but a dB or two in your low end can be pretty significant. And if you're not in a room that lets you hear all this stuff really clearly, that 1 or 2 dB loss in power may not seem like a big deal to you, but in a super big, loud club environment, that's going to be a pretty significant, perceptible difference. Okay, now it's only a difference if you've heard the before and after, of course, but the point is, in this case, a 12 dB slope, because it extends further up the spectrum, is probably attenuating those notes a little too much. It's doing it fairly equally, but I feel like I'm getting a slightly better overall response and the most power when I pick a steeper slope for this particular song and these particular notes on this particular sub. Again, it always just depends. Just a little more power. It's back where it was, and if I turn off the filter, it's going to look exactly the same. Right? They're all equally powerful whether the filter's on or off. Now let's flip over to the bell trick just to show you that the bell trick has its own set of problems, right? So if I flip over here to the bell trick, and right now it's centered at 10 hertz, and we'll do the thing with the cue here and see what happens. Let me just kind of dynamically slot this in, and we'll bring the whole track back so it's easier to hear.
I do my best to learn to listen. Since you have so, I do my best to learn to listen.
See, even with the bell shaped about like this, with that much cue on it, I'm already seeing these three notes are getting out of whack again.
I do my best to learn to listen.
See how the C is slightly below the line, the D is slightly below the line. So I'm not sure that the bell trick is any significantly better than the low pass filter trick, at least not for this sub. We could try moving this up closer to 20 and getting that dip happening around 20. Let's see what that looks like. Again, maximum cue to start, and we'll just slowly roll it back this way and see what happens.
I do my best to learn to listen. I do my best to learn to listen.
Right? Even the tiniest bit of expansion of the slope, you can see the C's already well below the line again, and even the D too.
I do my best to learn to listen.
Well, the D's right on the line, but the C's definitely below. So this trick isn't being as good to me as just using a plain old low pass filter in this context. But now here's the thing I really want you to see, okay? We're playing with this hypothetical high pass filter. We're trying to find the right frequency for it so it doesn't affect, the perceived loudness of the sub-riff. We're trying to find a slope that doesn't affect the perceived loudness of the sub-riff. We're trying to do this as non-destructively as possible, as transparently as possible, because theoretically, it's supposed to be reducing a bunch of excess information down below 30 hertz that we don't need. Remember, that was one of the arguments for high passing, okay, is that you can sometimes push the mix louder into a mastering limiter because you're giving yourself more headroom down in this ultra low subsonic range that most speakers can't reproduce. And if there's all this energy here, that's hurting your mastering limiter, making it have to push too much stuff down, and it's going to not be able to push as far down before it becomes audible and sounds like it's messing up your low end and making it sound squashed and rubbery and distorted and a zillion other adjectives, right? That's the argument. Now, I'm just going to point out at this point, if you're doing everything the clip to zero way, you've already solved most of this problem. You've already found whether or not the kick and the sub are going to play nicely together in your mix long before you ever got to mastering and turning on a mastering limiter. And because clip to zero is doing lots of little tiny clips all along the way up to the master, you're already hitting your target loudness long before you get to the master. And the mastering limiter is just doing a tiny bit of final work for last minute polish and gloss and pretty processing you might do on the full mix, like with things like Golthos or Smart EQ or tape saturator or something like that, right? Final little fairy dust and shine and polish that you put on a mix. That's all the mastering limiter is going to be dealing with, is any final peaks put on by those processes. My raw mix is already super loud and there's no problems. You're not hearing any problems. So the big question is this theory true? Is there always, without question, a bunch of unnecessary energy in this range that needs to be cut? Okay, let's find out. So I'm going to turn the filter off. And I want you to watch the trace line. This spectrum analyzer is going all the way down to 5 hertz. We're seeing way below the range that most speakers start losing energy, which is around 30 hertz, right? Anything below 30 is often considered unnecessary. So let's chop it off. Let's get rid of it because it just gets in the way, right? Let's find out. So what I want you to pay attention to is the shape of the white line on this edge of all the sound, and see where it's cutting through the grid and where it's falling along these grid lines.
I do my best to learn to listen.
Got that? It's kind of running around here, okay? Now I'm going to turn on this steep low pass filter at 20, 48 slope, sitting here at 20 hertz. It should be cutting out a lot of energy below, starting around the mid 20s. It should be cutting a lot of this out, right? Take a look at the lines.
I do my best to learn to listen.
Got that shape? See where it's sitting? Now what I'm going to do is just go back and forth and watch with your eyeballs. What's the difference in the slope and coverage of this line?
I do my best to learn to listen.
Off, on,
I do my best to learn to listen.
off,
I do my best to learn to listen.
on,
I do my best to learn to listen.
off.
I do my best to learn to listen.
Are you seeing any significant change in the total amount of energy here? No, you're not. And that's why I didn't put any high pass filters on this one. Because while this can, in some cases, in some mixes, with the sound design you've done and the kind of mixing you've done and the kind of side chaining you've done and a whole bunch of other decisions you've made along the way, yeah, maybe putting a high pass filter sometimes might give you more headroom down here in the low end by taking away some of this excess energy below where your important fundamentals are sitting. But not always. It's not making any difference at all in this song. None whatsoever. And I'll further put out that, sometimes what we think of as unnecessary noise down here or rumble, right? Stuff that people will describe as rumble below 30 or unnecessary stuff below 30. As I pointed out in episode 15 in excruciating detail, so go back here if you haven't seen it yet, what we think of as, don't you hear all that rumble and mud below 30? Let's get rid of that. It's not really rumble. It's instead phase interaction with the mid-range sounds in your mix that you haven't properly attenuated and gotten away from interfering with your sub and mixing in a bad way with your sub. And that's the kind of interaction that can be really hard to hear unless you use some tricks or tools that I describe in episode 15. And so what I think happens is there's more than a few producers who'll put out YouTube videos who'll say, see, can't you hear how that makes that rumble better? And it's because they haven't fixed the rumble where they really should have fixed it in the first place, because it's not actually rumble. Rumble is microphone. It's recorded noise. It's something that sneaks in on your microphones when you're recording sounds. A lot of times what's described as rumble is really phase interaction between different tracks in your mix that you haven't mixed properly, that you haven't looked carefully at how they're blending down in this very fragile and important sub-region, right? And so you let a lot of clutter and energy and phase rubbing and interaction sneak in down here. And so you think by putting a filter at 30 hertz, you're somehow getting rid of that. And you might be, because you're finally fixing the problem, but you're fixing it in the wrong place the wrong way. You're fixing it down here on something like your sub, right? By taking away beef and energy from your sub and your kick, instead of the way you should have done it, which was by taking away all the conflicting energy from mid-range sounds, mid basses, aggressive leads, even vocals. You need to get out this energy from those sounds and high pass it out of the way on those other sounds to clean up this range, not by murdering your kick and your sub and putting a high pass filter on those two end sounds. Leave them alone. Most of the time, they're just fine. It's really, I haven't run into too many cases where I have found a need or any benefit from putting a high pass filter on my sub or my kick. I think it could be theoretically possible, but I don't seem to choose kicks and subs that need that. That's me. Your mileage may vary. So I'm just making you aware. Know where the real problem lies. Fix the problem at the real source, not by blindly following some advice from somebody who may have just had a bad mix to begin with and doesn't really understand what they're doing and why it's making it sound quote unquote better. Okay? So that's, I think I've covered all of these arguments for and shown when it might not be actually doing you any good, even though theoretically these are good arguments, right? Sometimes it's not really what's going on. And that's why I got all these big sometimes here. And then we talked about linear phase not necessarily being a solution, and phase issues actually not really being the reason to avoid this, right? We did show this in a lot of detail and how it depends. And you just have to take each mix case by case and decide where to put this if you're going to use it. We talked about how to check whether or not this is actually doing you any good by not just using your ears, but also double checking the spectrum analyzer to verify that you have truly made some visible improvement down here, in addition to what your ears might be telling you, which might be very deceptive depending on your room and the way you're listening to this stuff. And we've talked about how, the big problem with putting any kind of filter down here is because you can't hear the low end very clearly in a lot of cases, you might be overdoing it and not realize it. And then your mix isn't nearly as heavy and thick as it otherwise could be if it's in a genre that really values heavy, thick, low end, like so much dance music and nowadays a lot of pop music. Okay, so hopefully this has been helpful, and I will see you in the next video.